Most people spend their entire lives trying to become someone the world will remember. I spent mine trying to understand why we need to be remembered at all. That question followed me for years, not because it demanded an answer, but because every answer I found felt borrowed. People spoke about purpose as if it was something waiting at the end of a long road. They treated meaning like a destination, believing that one extraordinary moment would suddenly explain every ordinary day that came before it. I never believed that if meaning exists, I think it hides in places we rarely think to look. It hides in unnoticed decisions, in conversations that seem unimportant while they're happening, in moments that disappear so quietly we don't realize they changed us until months later. Life doesn't usually transform us through explosions. It transforms us through repetition. One thought repeated often enough becomes a belief. One belief repeated long enough becomes a personality. And eventually, that personality becomes a prison we mistake for who we are. That's what frightened me. Not failure, not loneliness, certainty. Because certainty has a strange habit of closing doors before we've even noticed they exist. The moment you become completely convinced that you know yourself, you stop paying attention to the parts of you that are still changing. You stop asking questions. You stop listening. You stop discovering. Without realizing it, you become an expert on a version of yourself that no longer exists. I think that's why I've always preferred questions over answers. Questions stay alive. Anawetters eventually become furniture. They settle into the room until nobody notices them anymore. Maybe that's why I often felt disconnected from the people around me. Not because we disagreed, because we were searching for different things. Most conversations seemed to end the moment everyone agreed. Mine usually began there. Agreement has never interested me as much as understanding. Understanding requires patience. It requires the willingness to admit that the first explanation is almost never the deepest one. People rarely show you who they are in their strongest moments. Strength performs, pressure reveals. Watch, watch someone when they're uncertain. Watch them when they don't know what to say next. Watch the silence they create without realizing it. That's where truth quietly introduces itself. I didn't learn that from books. I learned it by watching, listening, remaining still long enough that people forgot they were being observed. It's remarkable what becomes visible when you're no longer trying to prove anything. The world slows down. Details become louder. Practices last longer. Even ordinary moments begin carrying unexpected weight. A stranger looking out of a train window. Someone smiling without realizing they are an unfinished sentence. A hesitation that lasts less than a second. Most people never notice these things. Not because they aren't there. Because they're too busy waiting for something bigger. I've started wondering if that's why so many people feel empty. They're searching for extraordinary experiences, while life quietly keeps handing them extraordinary observations. Maybe we've been measuring significance the wrong way. Maybe the moments that shape us are almost always the ones that don't announce themselves. A single sentence can outlive 1,000 speeches. One honest conversation can quietly rearrange years of assumptions. A simple realization can divide your life into two parts without anyone else noticing it happened. That's the strange thing about change. It rarely asks for permission, it simply begins. Long before the outside world has any evidence that something inside you has already become different. And once that process starts, there comes a moment when you recognize the person staring back at you isn't someone new. It's someone who has been waiting patiently beneath years of noise, hoping that one day you'd become quiet enough to finally hear them. The strange part is, once you begin hearing that quieter version of yourself, it becomes impossible to silence it again. You can distract yourself, film your schedule, surround yourself with people, lose yourself in endless routines. For a while, it almost works. Almost. But there's always a moment when the noise fades, usually late at night, or during an ordinary afternoon when nothing particularly important is happening, and that quiet voice returns with the same question. Are you living your life or simply repeating it? I avoided that question for longer than I'd like to admit. Not because I didn't understand it, because I already knew the answer. There's a difference between movement and progress. From the outside, they often look identical. Both keep you busy. Both make it seem like you're going somewhere. But only one actually changes you. The other simply keeps you occupied. For years, I confused the two. I thought discipline alone would eventually create fulfillment. Wake up, work, improve, repeat. There's nothing wrong with that cycle until the cycle becomes your identity. Until you become so focused on becoming better that you forget to ask a much simpler question, better for what? That question changed everything. Because the moment I asked it honestly, I realized how many of my goals weren't actually mine. Some had been inherited, some had been borrowed. Others had quietly formed from watching what everyone else seemed to admire. Without noticing it, I'd been chasing destinations I never personally chose. It's remarkable how easily people mistake popularity for purpose. If enough people walk in one direction, we begin assuming they know something we don't. So we follow. Not because we're convinced, because we're afraid of being the only one standing still. But standing still has taught me more than running ever did. When you stop moving for a moment, you begin noticing what was moving you: fear, expectation, comparison, habit, invisible forces making decisions long before you believed you had. That realization was uncomfortable. I like believing I'm in control. Most people do, but control isn't as complete as we imagine. Sometimes we're simply obeying patterns we've repeated so many times that they've started feeling like choices. Think about it. How many opinions have you actually examined? How many beliefs have you questioned deeply enough to know whether they truly belong to you? How many dreams would still exist if nobody else could see you achieving them? Those questions stayed with me, not because they were impossible to answer, because they demanded honesty. And honesty is expensive. It asks you to let go of stories you've spent years telling yourself. Stories about who you are, who you're supposed to become, what success should look like, which version of yourself deserves approval. One by one, those stories began falling apart. Surprisingly, I didn't feel empty afterward. I felt lighter. It's exhausting carrying identities that were never built for you. The moment you put them down, you realize how much energy you've been wasting pretending they fit. That's when I noticed something else. People rarely fear change. They fear the emptiness that comes before a new identity forms. We'd rather stay inside familiar discomfort than enter unfamiliar freedom. Because at least discomfort gives us certainty. Freedom doesn't. Freedom asks us to decide, and decisions reveal responsibility. No one else can choose your direction once you've accepted that your life is truly your own. That's terrifying, but it's also strangely beautiful, because it means every ordinary day becomes an opportunity to begin again, not dramatically, Quietly, you don't become a different person overnight. You become slightly more honest today than you were yesterday, then you repeat it. Eventually, honesty stops feeling like effort. It becomes your natural way of existing. I've started believing that growth isn't about adding new pieces to yourself. It's about removing everything that was never really yours. The expectations, the masks, the constant need to appear certain. What's left underneath is usually much simpler than we imagined. Not perfect, not complete, just real. And reality has a calmness that performance can never imitate. You stop chasing attention. You stop needing every decision to impress someone. You begin measuring your life by a different standard. Not, does this look successful? But, does this feel true? Those two questions rarely produce the same answer. Truth is quieter, less glamorous, but infinitely more stable because appearances change. Truth doesn't need to. The more I understood that, the more I realized something I'd overlooked for years. Peace isn't something you find after solving every problem. Peace begins the moment you stop arguing with who you actually are, not who you hope to become, not who others expect. Who you are right now, oddly enough, that's where real transformation begins. Not in self-rejection, in self-recognition, because only what is honestly seen can honestly evolve. Everything else is just another performance. And I've grown tired of performing. Maybe that's what maturity really is. Not having all the answers. Finally becoming comfortable enough to live without pretending you do. The world teaches us to admire certainty. Life keeps teaching me to admire awareness instead. Awareness notices. Awareness questions. Awareness remains humble enough to accept that every ending might secretly be another beginning. Perhaps that's why I no longer rush toward conclusions. Some truths need silence before they can speak clearly. Some lessons only arrive after we've stopped chasing them. And maybe the most meaningful journey isn't the one that takes us farther from where we started. Maybe it's the one that slowly brings us back to ourselves, to the version that existed long before fear introduced itself, long before comparison became habit, long before the world explained who we should become. Because underneath all of that noise, there has always been someone patiently waiting, not asking to be reinvented, only remembered. There's something no one tells you about becoming more aware. It doesn't immediately make life easier. If anything, it makes it more complicated. Because once you begin seeing clearly, you also begin noticing everything you used to overlook, the conversations that never really say anything, the ambitions built entirely on comparison, the relationships held together by habit instead of understanding. At first, it feels overwhelming, not because the world has changed, because your ability to see it has. That's the hidden cost of awareness. You lose the comfort of illusion, and illusions are often more comforting than truth. Truth asks more from you. It asks you to stop pretending that the life you're living happened by accident. It asks you to admit that many of your decisions were shaped by fears you never questioned. It asks you to recognize that every excuse you've repeated long enough eventually begins to sound like reality. I reached that realization one ordinary evening. There was nothing remarkable about the day. No major success, no painful failure. Just an ordinary moment sitting alone after everything had become quiet. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to distract myself. No music, no notifications, no conversation, just silence. And in that silence, I noticed something unexpected. My mind had been running for years without ever asking where it was actually going. Thought after thought, Goal after goal, plan after plan, but very little presence. It was as though I had mastered the art of preparing for life without fully participating in it. That realization stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, because it was undeniable. I began paying attention differently after that, not to the future, to the present, the way morning light entered a room, the sound of rain against a window, the expression on someone's face before they answered a difficult question. Life suddenly felt richer, not because anything new had appeared, because I had finally slowed down enough to notice what had always been there. I think we've been taught to chase extraordinary moments for so long that we've forgotten ordinary moments are where life actually happens. Most of our existence isn't made of milestones. It's made of Tuesdays, of waiting, of walking, of eating meals while thinking about tomorrow instead of tasting today. Somewhere along the way, we became tourists in our own lives, always looking ahead to the next destination, rarely appreciating the place we're already standing. I was guilty of that too. I believed fulfillment lived somewhere in the future. Just one more achievement, one more accomplishment, one more version of myself waiting around the corner. But every time I reached one destination, another appeared. The finish line kept moving. Not because success was dishonest, because desires no natural ending. It always whispers the same sentence. Just a little more money, a little more recognition, a little more certainty, a little more proof. The problem is, just a little more can quietly become an entire lifetime. And by the time you notice, you've spent decades chasing a horizon that was never meant to be reached. That frightened me, not failure, wasted attention. Because attention is the most valuable thing we own. Whatever receives it eventually shapes us. If you constantly focus on comparison, comparison becomes your identity. If you constantly focus on fear, fear begins making your decisions. Before you do, if you constantly focus on what you're missing, you'll eventually lose the ability to recognize what you already have. Attention is like water. Whatever you pour it into begins to grow. I wish someone had told me that earlier. Perhaps they did. Perhaps I simply wasn't ready to hear it. Readiness is another strange thing. The same sentence can mean nothing for years. Then one day it changes your life. Not because the sentence became different, because you did. Growth isn't always about discovering new wisdom. Sometimes it's about finally understanding wisdom that has been waiting for you all along. That thought gave me unexpected peace. It reminded me that life isn't a race toward knowing everything. It's a gradual unfolding, one layer at a time, one realization at a time, one honest conversation with yourself at a time. I've stopped expecting sudden transformation. The movies make it seem as though people change overnight. Real life rarely works that way. Real change is almost invisible while it's happening. You choose patience once, then again tomorrow. You tell the truth when lying would have been easier. You forgive someone without announcing it. You let go of an old resentment no one else even knew you were carrying. None of those moments look extraordinary. Yet together, they quietly become a different life. That's how mountains are formed. Not in a single movement. Through countless moments, too small to notice individually. Maybe people are built the same way. Not by grand decisions. By ordinary choices repeated consistently enough that they become character. Character has always fascinated me. Not reputation. Reputation belongs to other people. Character belongs to you. Reputation changes every time someone tells your story. Character remains even when no one is watching. If I had to choose between the two, I know which one I'd protect, because the world will misunderstand you eventually. That's unavoidable. Someone will judge your silence as weakness, your kindness as naivety, your confidence as arrogance, your boundaries as distance. You can't control those interpretations, and trying to will only exhaust you. The only thing you truly control is whether you continue becoming the person you respect once the opinions fade away. I've realized that's the only audience that never leaves. Your own conscience. It remembers every compromise, every excuse, every act of courage no one applauded, every promise you kept when breaking it would have been easier. In the end, that's the voice you have to live with, not the crowd, not the applause, not the criticism, just yourself. And strangely enough, the more honest I became with myself, the less I needed the world to confirm who I was. Vitalation lost its grip. Comparis lost its urgency. Even uncertainty stopped feeling like an enemy, because I finally understood something simple. You don't need to know exactly where your life is leading. You only need to know whether the person taking the next step is becoming more truthful than the one who took the last. If the answer is yes, then you're already moving in the right direction, even if the road ahead remains invisible, even if nobody else understands it, even if progress feels painfully slow. Because the deepest transformations never demand attention. They simply continue quietly shaping you until one ordinary day you look back and realize the person who began the journey would barely recognize the one who kept walking. And perhaps that's the closest thing to real success any of us will ever find. Maybe that's the quiet truth hidden beneath every meaningful journey. We spend years searching for the moment that will finally explain everything, believing that clarity arrives like a flash of lightning. We imagine one perfect realization that suddenly organizes every unanswered question into a complete picture. Life rarely works that way. Understanding isn't an event. It's a relationship with your own mind. And like every relationship, it grows through attention. The more honestly you observe yourself, the less energy you spend protecting an identity that no longer fits. You stop defending old versions of yourself simply because you've invested time in becoming them. There's a freedom in admitting you've changed, not because change makes you better, because it makes you truthful. For a long time, I thought strength meant never doubting yourself. Now, I think real strength begins the moment you're willing to question everything except your commitment to honesty. That commitment changes the way you move through the world. You listen more carefully, you speak more intentionally, you stop reacting to every opinion as if it deserves space inside your mind. Not every voice deserves your attention. Not every criticism deserves your guilt. Not every compliment deserves your identity. People will always see you through the lens of their own experiences. There's Some will admire you for the very qualities others misunderstand. Some will misunderstand you for the very qualities others value. Neither defines you. The mistake is believing they do. The older I become, the more I realize that peace has very little to do with controlling circumstances. It has everything to do with refusing to abandon yourself in order to fit into someone else's expectations. That doesn't mean becoming stubborn. It means becoming rooted. A tree doesn't argue with the wind, it simply grows deeper roots. Maybe people should do the same because storms are inevitable, disappointment is inevitable, chalt is inevitable. The only real question is whether your foundation depends on things that can disappear. If your identity depends on applause, silence will destroy you. If it depends on perfection, mistakes will define you. If it depends on comparison, someone else's success will always feel like your failure. But if your foundation is built on integrity, then even uncertainty becomes bearable. You begin trusting the process instead of demanding immediate answers. You stop asking, when will my life finally make sense? And you begin asking something far more important. Am I becoming someone I can respect? That question has no finish line. It follows you through every season of life, through success and failure, through confidence and doubt, through beginnings that excite you and endings that break you. And perhaps that's exactly why it matters. Because a meaningful life isn't measured by how often everything goes according to plan. It's measured by the person you choose to become while the plan keeps changing. Looking back now, I don't think the greatest moments of my life were the ones everyone else noticed. They were the invisible ones. The decision to forgive without needing recognition. The courage to start again after believing it was too late. The humility to admit I was wrong. The patience to wait instead of forcing what wasn't ready. No audience applauded those moments. Yet those were the moments that quietly shaped everything that came after. That's how life works. The smallest decisions become the deepest roots. And one day, without realizing when it happened, those roots become the reason you remain standing when everything around you begins to shake. So if you're still searching, don't search for a perfect life, reach for an honest one. Don't ask whether the road ahead is easy. Ask whether it's true. Don't measure your worth by how many people understand your journey. Measure it by whether you're becoming more genuine with every step you take. Because in the end, the world won't remember every achievement. Time slowly erases almost all of them. But the person you become while pursuing those achievements, that remains. It remains in the way you treat people when no one is watching. It remains in the promises you keep when breaking them would be easier. It remains in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your actions and your values no longer live separate lives. Maybe that's what fulfillment has been trying to teach us all along. It was never waiting at the end of the road. It was quietly growing inside every honest step we chose to take. And perhaps the journey was never about becoming someone completely new. Perhaps it was always about removing everything that prevented you from recognizing the person who had been there from the very beginning. When that realization finally settles, the search doesn't end. It simply changes. You stop chasing a destination, and you begin living with intention. One day, one choice, one honest moment at a time. Because sometimes the greatest transformation isn't becoming someone else, it's finally having the courage to become yourself.